Preparing and launching this report, which I think goes to the heart of an increasingly important policy area, not just for Malaysia, but also for all ASEAN countries. So I'm going to explain a bit more about the report, why it's an issue that matters, and what the situation here is in Malaysia with regards to intellectual property rights, and also comparing the situation here to what's happening elsewhere in ASEAN. So the report, which I hope you have a copy of on your desk, if not, there's a summary available, also available on the IDEAS website, is a collaboration between 6 think tanks from around the region. The objective of the report is to raise awareness of the role of and importance of intellectual property rights for development, which I'll explain a bit more about in a minute, and then sets out a reform agenda for a high standard IP system that can underpin economic growth and social development. It's not a technical report. It doesn't have lots of very technical recommendations and reform ideas. It's more about principles and some of the things that work and don't work, and what countries can do to bring themselves up to the highest possible standards. So the key question, which I think there's a general lack of awareness of around the world, is why IP is now very much more important than it was 20, 30 years ago. So in summary, IP helps economies shift from the old industrial-based economy towards a more knowledge-based economy, which is where real prosperity will come from. So if you take a country like Malaysia, Malaysia's gone through quite some different stages of development over the last 20, 30 years. So it's gone from being an agrarian economy to a manufacturing-based economy based on the manufacturing of physical goods, the exports of natural resources, and some agriculture, reliant quite considerably on lots of unskilled labour. It's moved on a bit from there. It's now much more involved in high-tech manufacturing and other value-added activities, but it's still not quite at the high-income stage. So it's still finding itself languishing in the middle-income stage, the upper middle-income stage. The question is, how does it make the leap and the final transition towards a high-income country? So where it wants to be is, it needs to be a more knowledge-based economy than it currently is. So that's the use of ideas, know-how, knowledge, intellectual property to create goods and services and trade them globally. High-tech manufacturing, research and development, innovation, digital goods and services, which involves skilled labor and generates much higher levels of productivity and economic growth. And most high-income countries today are very much knowledge-based economies. So take the US as an example. If you look at the bar chart on the left, what that illustrates is the structural shift that the US economy has undertaken since the mid-1970s. So the bar chart on the far left shows the blue chunk shows that the vast majority of the output or value of the biggest companies in the United States in the 1970s was based on manufacturing physical goods, so-called tangible assets. And only a very small proportion, 17%, in 1975 was due to knowledge-based goods and services, brands, idea, intellectual property, and so on. And you can see over the intervening 40 years or so, we go up to 2015, that situation has completely flipped on its head and it's changed completely. So the biggest companies in the US make almost all their money these days from intellectual property rather than manufacturing physical things or digging oil out the ground or exporting grain and cereal and so forth. And the line graph on the right shows, if you go back in time, that the rise of intangible goods and services in the United States has been on an upward trend since the 1940s, whereas we get to today, it totally dominates the US economy. And that's not true of just the US. It's also true of many ASEAN success stories, Singapore most notably, and then outside of ASEAN in the region, Japan, Taiwan, and Malaysia catching up ground fast as well. So intellectual property rights are now much more important in a knowledge-based economy than they were in the old manufacturing, intangible, asset-based economy from the past. There's two main reasons for this, which I'll explain briefly now. Firstly, innovation and research and development is now a global, international endeavor involving lots of different organizations and companies across borders. And secondly, global manufacturing chains are again internationally dispersed and are also very knowledge intensive and require IP for them to function properly. So I'll just go into a bit more detail about that. So the first part of this is innovation. So in the old days, innovation used to take place generally within one company or one country in a vertically integrated model. Take the manufacturing of medicines, for example. So in the old days, one big company would do the basic research in-house, then it would take it through the clinical trials, it would get marketing approval, then it would brand and market it, and distribute it from one company in one country in a big organization. That's changed completely now. It's now a much more networked international model. So this example, again, is from the life science sector. So you have lots of different companies, organizations, public, private sector, academia, all collaborating in the research and development of new products across borders and across markets as well. So, for example, you have academia, startups, and small businesses doing early stage research. They could be in lots of different countries. You have the clinical trials taking place in yet more countries, and Malaysia has a particular comparative advantage there. You have branding and other IP-intensive work taking place in yet more companies. And the overall owner of the IP rights simply kind of manages the interface between these organizations and becomes more of the center of a network of innovation. And the reason why intellectual property rights is key now is because all these relationships and collaborations can't take place unless everyone is certain of where they stand legally with regard to the sharing of confidential or commercially sensitive knowledge. You can't be sharing with small companies in Malaysia and then again in the Philippines if they're not all working on the same playing field with regards to the protection of intellectual property. So that's innovation. And then global value chains, which have been discussed quite extensively in the previous part of this forum. So we've discussed the rise of the global value chains and the increasing role of Malaysia in taking part in those value chains. It's also important to note that manufacturing value chains are now increasingly knowledge intensive. So most of the value is not coming from actually putting the components together of a new product. It's more about the research and development and the design and the branding and the after-sales servicing. That's where the real value is coming from. And according to research from the World Intellectual Property Organization, that's the UN agency in charge of the global IP framework, now 1/3 of all manufactured products sold around the world the value of that comes from intangible capital. And again, intellectual property is key to enable these different players to work together and collaborate in the ultimate pursuit of creating a new product or technology and distributing it. So Malaysia is already pretty well advanced on its innovation journey. It's already taking part in global value chains, and it's already taking part in global innovation networks to an extent. It's doing considerably better than lots of its neighbors. This is the Global Innovation Index, again, compiled by the World Intellectual Property Organization in collaboration with INSEAD, which is a French business school. So Malaysia has lots of advantages which can help it become a more innovative and prosperous economy. It has quite developed markets, it has good regulations in many spheres, it has the rule of law, and it has access and connectivity to many other regional and international markets. So there's a good basis from which Malaysia can work from. But the question is, does it have the IP framework that can help it move into the upper tier of innovation countries around the world? I'm not saying intellectual property is the key or the only element that makes a country innovative, but it's certainly a precondition. There's very few countries that have managed to become innovation economies without a strong and robust framework for the protection of intellectual property rights. So where does Malaysia stand, and indeed other ASEAN countries? Well, Malaysia is doing pretty well in terms of ASEAN. Only Singapore outranks it in terms of the strength, scope, and robustness of its IP system, Singapore is a global leader and not just a regional leader. But globally speaking, Malaysia falls around middle of the pack around the world for the strength of its IP system. So these are figures from the US Chamber's Global IP Index on the left. And then on the right, that's the Property Rights Alliance International Property Rights Index, the IP component of that. So that's two different organizations have come out with fairly similar fairly similar findings about the strength of the IP systems around the world. So Malaysia is certainly doing better than competitors like Philippines, Thailand, certainly Vietnam and Indonesia, but it's still got some way to catch up with the global best practice. And bear in mind, meanwhile, in the background, you have behemoths like China and India who are rapidly making improvements to their IP systems because their governments have made a strategic decision to move away from being copying economies or simply economies that make money from assembling components invented elsewhere. They have a strategic objective to become more innovative economies. China certainly has been upgrading its IP system quite substantially in the last couple of years, creating a level playing field between foreign and Chinese companies and improving its regulations in other areas. And even India, which for many years has been very skeptical of IP from a developmental perspective, has been making some significant improvements. So Malaysia and other Asean countries have to be aware of the competitive landscape in this field that's changing quite rapidly. So the downward glide of this presentation now, I'll just go through some of the main areas of intellectual property rights, where Malaysia sits and what it's doing well and what it could be doing a little bit better. So we'll look at patents quickly, and those are patents are used to protect inventions, industrially applicable inventions, and copyright, which is key to the creative industries, movies and books and software, and then trademarks, which is used to protect brands. So not just luxury brands, but it's also pretty much any brand you see on any form of product. So the patent system strength in Malaysia. Malaysia's doing okay from an ASEAN perspective. It has a fairly strong framework of patent protection. There was a big reform in 2011 where lots of gaps were plugged. And this is for good reason, because patents are central to the business models of many high-value industrial sectors, which Malaysia hopes to attract investment in and also develop its own. In the EU, patent-intensive sectors constitute about 15% of total GDP and about 17% of total employment. So that, I think, illustrates the scale of the opportunity for Malaysia if it has a decent functional patent system. So the two main areas with the patent system in Malaysia. It can take quite some time to get a patent in Malaysia, bearing in mind they last for 20 years from the moment of filing. It can take up to 4 years for a patent to be granted by the Malaysian Patent Office. Many take much less than that, but that's a spread between 1 and 4 years. Certainly, by no means the weakest performer in ASEAN, which is Thailand by some measure. The MIPO, the local patent office, has recently instituted some work-sharing arrangements with the European Patent Office and the Japan Patent Office to cut down on bureaucracy and speed up the patent examination. And I think there's also discussions, well, has been for many years, about a work-sharing agreement between ASEAN, ASPEC. I can't exactly remember what the acronym stands for, but there is plans to integrate and do more information sharing between ASEAN patent offices, which could reduce the amount of duplication when you file a patent between the various different countries and speed up patent examination, which is crucial to the overall integrity and performance of patent systems. The second issue is compulsory licensing, so that's the confiscation or the overriding of patents for medicines. The theory being that if you can reduce the cost of medicines by simply overriding the intellectual property rights and then manufacturing generic equivalents. That's There's a big debate around that at the moment, but it does send alarm bells ringing around the international investment circles and can reduce the desirability of Malaysia, or indeed any other country that entertains this tool, something of a nuclear option. It does cast questions over the integrity of the entire patent system. So to be used with caution, I would urge. Then we come on to copyright. So this copyright is very important for the creative industries, film, TV, and online websites and code development and so forth. Again, Malaysia is a regional leader. Ignore Singapore, because Singapore wins just about everything with regards to IP. But Malaysia is certainly much stronger than many of its neighbours in the Asean region. There's been quite a lot of work by the local IP office to work to take down infringing content online. And there's been a big crackdown on online piracy and work with ISPs to remove pirated movies and software that's shared amongst internet users. But nevertheless, piracy is still quite a big problem in Malaysia, as indeed it is in all ASEAN countries, costing the Malaysian film and TV industry 2,000 jobs and 1,300 jobs in supporting value chain last year alone, costing the economy an estimated 2.27 billion ringgits in opportunity loss revenue to the economy and 30 million ringgits in taxes in 2017, according to another study. And then trademarks. Trademarks protect brands, so not just your designer handbags, but also, as I mentioned, agricultural produce, food, pharmaceuticals, and so on and so forth. Pretty much every item you buy has a brand or a trademark associated with it. And very important to the Malaysian economy, worth about 30% of Malaysia's GDP, trademark-intensive industries, and about 24% of employment. And then, again, when we go back to the participation in global value chains, trademark protection is crucial because, take, for example, the high-tech ICT industry. Every part or every component is protected by trademark. And if the trademark system is weak, there's no guarantee that counterfeit products won't infiltrate those value chains and undermine the entire production of that technology. So protecting trademarks is key to the successful functioning of manufacturing value chains. And therefore, I think the government has been correct to take it seriously as an economic problem. Nevertheless, counterfeits are still widespread here in Malaysia, and as indeed they are elsewhere in Asia. Medicines can be quite a problem. Machine spare parts, IT goods, luxury items, chemicals and food and drinks. The IP office is constantly, the customs authorities are constantly seizing counterfeit goods and will continue to have a problem on their hands. I think one issue has been highlighted, one particular weakness within the trademark protection system within Malaysia is the inability or the lack of laws to allow customs officials to seize suspected counterfeit goods that are transiting through the country. So they have the power to seize goods that have arrived in the country, but not ones that are transiting through, which is potentially quite a big gap in the protection of brands. So to conclude, if you go to the report, there's some recommendations, which I won't go into now. But just to summarize, IP is really about moving Malaysia up the economic value chain. It's about promoting economic development, which won't happen. That shift to the high-income economy won't happen without the existence of a strong framework of intellectual property rights. Other countries, including China and India, certainly recognize this and making reforms. And I applaud the efforts of MIPO and the government to continue reforming the Malaysian IP system as well. So do download the report from the IDEAS website, and do come and find me afterwards if you'd like to discuss further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip, for that wonderful presentation. So, moving on to the next panel, of course, on the topic of intellectual property. A kind reminder again to everyone that the floor, of course, will be open to questions using the Slido app. So the code now is L791. It will be displayed on the screen as well as the QR code on your agenda. Now, as the groundwork is set, I would like to again invite Philip Stevens again, our Senior Fellow from IDEAS and Director of Geneva Network. Nasir Jaafar, Chief Executive Officer from Agency Inovasi Malaysia. Benjamin Thompson, President of the Malaysian Intellectual Property Association. Professor Dr. Ida Madiha Abdul Ghani Azmi from IIUM, and Associate Professor Dr. Tai Peksan from University Malaya. Of course, moderating the session will be our very own Chief Executive Officer of IDEAS, Ali Salman. A round of applause for our esteemed panel members.
Oh, hello, and good afternoon. I'm pleased to see that most of you are still here, continuing and supporting this important discussion, and hoping to have some conversation on this important topic. As a moderator, I will, first of all, feel free if you want to just, jump in physically and raise some question or a point. Or address to Slido. So I'm creating both options. I'm still, belong to that generation which is more used to more interactive discussion and not Slido type. But I still, acknowledge and the technological role here. So welcome to all the panelists. Thank you, Mr. Nasir Jaafar, for joining us, and also Benjamin Thompson, as well as Dr. Ida and Dr. Tay. I think we are looking forward for a discussion on the intellectual property, but moving from intellectual property to knowledge economy. That is the discussion really today. And with your respective role, I mean, Mr. Nasir Jaafar, you head the Innovation Agency of Malaysia. Mr. Ben, you head the Intellectual Property Association, and Dr. Tay and Dr. Ida, you are academics from different backgrounds. We hope to have, we hope to build from this discussion and broaden our horizon in terms of knowledge economy. Now. Let me also clarify that I'm CEO of IDEAS, yes, but and we are publisher of the report which Philip just presented very masterfully. But for this session, I would like to take the hat of CEO of IDEAS off, and I like to take on the moderator of this discussion on. So, I hope Phil doesn't mind if I do not agree with all the arguments presented in favor of intellectual property, and just in the interest of wider discussion, yeah. So we will follow the order as the program. So I will be inviting the panelists to make opening remarks, maybe for about 7 to 8 minutes, and then we will hopefully carry on some discussion from here. Now, so one set of argument which essentially Philip Stevens presented in his report is this the importance of intellectual property, how countries have progressed by protecting the intellectual property, means copyrights, trademarks, and patents, and how the protection on these institutions is directly linked with the economic progress. And so we saw a distribution of countries in one of the graph, in which we saw the countries which are developed today are also those countries which are more protective of IP, and which are countries are less developed today are also less protective. So you can see that strong relationship. And Malaysia is somewhere in the middle, right? And so importance of innovation has been acknowledged. But there's also this other set of arguments in the literature and also in broader activism and policy discussion around the world, which I think Phil also acknowledged in his presentation, was that Adam Smith, for instance, referred to as IP as necessary evil, but still evil. Also, there have been various studies recently which also consider that IP or patents is like granting monopoly rights, government licenses, monopoly rights for companies to profit for a long time over others, and it may actually deter competition. So that's the counter argument which is often given. And we have in this afternoon, this whole seminar, we have been hearing about US-China trade war. And let's not forget that one of the most important dispute points is actually IP, right? So between US and China, what US is saying that China is not respecting IP. Right? If we go back to the history 60, 70 years ago, we know that how actually Japan developed and other countries developed was not necessarily through pure innovation. Was actually a process of reverse engineering and copying, and then later on graduating, developing themselves to a certain degree of development. So there are these arguments which we often still hear, and one can mention China as a modern miracle of economic development. Which actually has not given due protection to IP, right? It has now started to pay more attention, but so far it has sort of avoided that. So we have these two sets of the argument: intellectual property, innovation, economic development, and especially on the knowledge economy. But we also have other. In terms of knowledge economy, we talk about digital economy. We talk about the e-commerce. There was a report by World Bank some months ago which suggested that Malaysia, the GDP contribution of digital economy is 17.8%, although there could be definitional issues of how digital economy and knowledge economy is being defined, but this is significant. Geneva's network report actually mentions that Malaysia GDP, that 20% of Malaysian GDP comes from trademark-intensive industries. So therefore, there is this importance of IP acknowledged. So, but we have, I think, in the interest of the discussion, we should present and discuss and debate these arguments. So, may I start by requesting Mr. Nasser Jaffer to make his opening remarks, and then we will follow the agenda, and we'll, if there are questions, we'll take it from here.
Thank you, Ali. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, IDEAS have invited me for a second time to be part of the IP conversation jointly back here again. For those who have not heard of Agency University Malaysia, there's been a lot of topics about Agency University Malaysia post GE14. We are an agency under the Prime Minister's Department. Our vision is to create wealth through three things: technology, knowledge, and innovation, obviously. And to achieve that vision, we need to strengthen the ecosystem of the innovation of the country. When we talk of ecosystem, it touches right from the beginning of our education system, the social innovation. As the country moves towards shared prosperity, no one must be left behind. So social innovation is something which we carry very heavily in our organization. We talked about industry collaboration. Why to us is very important, because the definition of knowledge economy that resonates with me is it's a system that supports consumption and production of intellectual capital. And I believe IP is a subset of intellectual capital. So we must see this in its holistic approach. So when you talk about consumption at AIM, we want to make sure that all the investments the government have made in the R&D at the universities, at the public research institutes, come out of the researchers' desk into the market, and that's wealth creation. So, and when you create IPs, it needs to be protected. I think that's very, very important. That's the beginning of the journey of commercialization. So our role here is to make sure that the funding ecosystem has got no gaps. It's getting more and more difficult to ensure there's no gaps, but we believe in working with partnership with all the ministries and agencies. It makes our job a bit easier because we're in the Prime Minister's Department. We've got 6 ministers on our board. Therefore, when you want to engage on something transformational, it's easier to get things done with a commitment for the two.
Thank you. May I request Mr. Benjamin to come with his opening remarks? Yeah?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Ideas for inviting MIPA. It's not able to come for the last one, but my Vice President did turn up. Perhaps I should start off, because I'm going to be commenting on the report. Perhaps I should start off by telling you a little bit about MIPA. So I'll start with the A, association. It's an association of IP owners, IP agents, IP users, academics, okay? So although I'm a lawyer by profession, today when I sit before you as president of MIPA, that is that aggregate view which I bring to this discussion. It's a balanced view. It's not pro-owner, neither is it pro-user. It's the view of somebody who's been in the field for about 30 years, and having seen it, having worked with inventors from an idea sketched out on the back of a tissue, right up to, you know, becoming a multimillionaire overnight, and the company got floated on the Australian Stock Exchange. So, but I also have the perspective of people who've chased acquiring intellectual property and lost their home, lost their savings, lost their marriage, lost their family. So it is that real practical experience that I hope you will take my comments in. So I would like to congratulate IDEA on this report. Let me focus now on the M, the Malaysia. I think some of the statistics, especially on Singapore, need to be taken with a bit of salt, and I explain to you why. If patents are the most important factor for the global indices, then we have to understand that Singapore, unlike I think almost all the other ASEAN countries, Singapore has a self-assessing system. Now, I don't guarantee many things, but I'm willing to take on anybody's idea for anything, you know, even for a cat with a dog's tail, right? We will get it patented in Singapore. Because literally, even if you get an extremely negative substantive examination report, you have the option of paying the final fee and getting your patent in Singapore. Because the idea there is that if there is a patent that needs to be removed, let the courts do it, let the parties decide, right? Comparatively, I would say in Malaysia, it's tough. If I'm representing a European or American client who has corresponding patents in those countries, it is relatively easy and speedy to get it registered in Malaysia, because we have modified substantive examination, and your report also highlights patent prosecution highway. So using those precedents, we can kind of leapfrog and get to where we want to go quickly. But a local inventor who is filing the patent in Malaysia and who has got no precedent to rely on at all, he's going to have a headache. because this is one examination that local My IPO has to thoroughly examine on their own without any precedent to rely on. So I do think that, in some of those things, the gap between Malaysia and Singapore is not that big. In fact, I would say our patent system definitely is more robust, and the patent on the Malaysian register is something that is worth being there. I'm glad also that, Ali, you did take a neutral tone on this. I thought I was going to be the only rebel here. Essentially, intellectual property, it is a necessary evil, as Adam Smith said. So while we are talking about systems, we also need to look at the human element, the economic element, because at the end of the day, this is about ASEAN, this is about Malaysia as one of the countries in ASEAN, using the system to improve lives, to improve the lives of people, improve the quality of living, for example, So it is important, I think, for us to prioritize the provisions or parts of the system which facilitate local innovation and growth. So for example, and with due apologies to anybody from Big Pharma or Big Tobacco, regulatory data, for example, I don't think is the top of the list for ASEAN countries who are still struggling with public health issues, as you also rightly pointed out, in Japan's experience, you can't start thinking about intellectual property without first having an enterprise, without that enterprise making some money, being able to pay for rent, being able to pay for salaries, then once it's stable, then you can maybe invest in intellectual property. And the bulk of the economy, SMEs for example, may actually be able to run very successful businesses without actually needing to innovate. All they need to do is to produce goods and services for people within the same town, within the same vicinity. So it's only at a certain level of development that a company actually becomes in a stage where they're thinking of export, they're thinking of larger markets, and then they may require the intellectual property system. So if we try to immediately benchmark against international best practices, and if the example that we are given consistently is the United States, then I think that is something that we need to take with a pinch of salt. Statistically that looks good, but are we in the same category to actually try and achieve all of those things? It's like if I have a racetrack day at Sepang, obviously if I take my kanchil, no matter how souped up it is, and I line up together with all the souped up Ferraris, there's only one way this race is going to end, correct? I will be still at the starting point when everybody has done 2 laps, right? So I at the risk of sounding too nationalistic, right? And I'm sure Nasir will back me up, I think we do need to understand, there are things that we need to pick and choose and make it our national agenda, which will, and these things must be the things which are going to benefit our local companies, our technologies which we are already strong in, where we already have the strengths. Pick and choose those parts of the IP system and strengthen them first so that we can get sufficient quantum to start competing. And while it is easy to say that the moment that we have a good IPR system, local companies can become participants in the global research and development networks and high-tech manufacturing. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that that is not always true. Many times, the Malaysian market is too small, so a foreign manufacturer may just want to supply a local distributor. And other than the sales, they're not interested in technology transfer or even allowing any of the local companies to get involved in research and design. But let's go further. Do we have any local companies which are already at the stage to be able to offer R&D services to somebody who's playing the globe, you know. So ASEAN must ask, what is our competitive advantage? What elements of the IP system do we need to prioritize so that our local companies can achieve the economic growth as quickly as possible and invest more heavily in IPR? So to just leave this point with one note, for example, patent examiners. Yes, hiring more patent examiners is going to help us clear the backlog. But I would say focus on hiring patent examiners who have the necessary skills to process all the local patent applications which are delayed because they have no precedent. You know, prioritize that. Get those local patent applications processed and out first. And I think then we will really be doing a service to ASEAN. My second point, Ali. Often we have this perceived weakness of the IPR system. Ladies and gentlemen, a system is only as good as procedures and processes to do something. So we have an IP court now for the last 12 years. If you did want to sue somebody for IP infringement, I could even, get you a trial date within a year, And other lawyers in Kuala Lumpur seeing me would spit at me out of envy because we have a specialist court, things move very fast. But how many people actually want to go through the cost of going out and enforcing their IP? Very often we see this attitude that people, private companies, want the government to spend public funds to protect their intellectual property, and I don't think that's right. Use public funds for the public. Private companies, and I give you a good example. How many of you still use an unlicensed version of Microsoft, and photographers quickly take a picture? Okay, no, I'm going to bet most people in Malaysia don't use unlicensed versions of Microsoft anymore. You know why? Because BSA, Software Alliance, Microsoft, they enforced, they raided offices, they made people print public apologies, they dragged people to court for both criminal offenses and civil offenses. And I would be very, very shocked to find enterprise now, anywhere in Kuala Lumpur anyway, that would dare to use unlicensed Microsoft Office, for example. And at the same time, the pricing for the software has come down. So is it that prices went down and that's why people are more compliant? Or is it that the high enforcement or strict enforcement is what drove high compliance? So we must see that many times when people complain, it is because they don't want to pay for that, and I don't think that is the correct thing. My third point, which is the final point, this is about compulsory licensing. I do note that in your report, you did equate this with uncertainty. I would, beg to differ. The provisions are very clear. It's not that the government can simply take 500 ringgit drug and sell it for 5 ringgit. There is a test of reasonableness at each stage. For example, 3 years after the patent, if there is no production without legitimate reason, or there is no product produced in Malaysia, or it is produced but it is at unreasonably high prices. The whole provision of Section 49, the Patents Act, the word reasonable keeps jumping up and down. So if you see that somebody actually has resorted to compulsory licensing to get some critical drug out to the Malaysian public, trust me, they've done everything reasonable. Because if they had not, why hasn't somebody gone and challenged it in the court and said that the government has been unreasonable? So this certainly the IPR is there to protect, to facilitate, but it is not to allow big pharma to dominate or to terrorize. You know, if we say that, oh, our expected or projected return on investment was 80% on the cost of the medication, and because of compulsory licensing, we only need to make 40%. Well, that is the whole point of compulsory licensing in IPR. So another thing that you said in your recommendations, to restrict compulsory licensing to true emergencies. What is a true emergency? When it comes to public health, you need to nip the problem in the bud. You cannot allow health issues to start escalating, because when they start multiplying, then things get out of control. Our whole health system may collapse. And just as an example, we had a similar issue when plain paper packaging was introduced. If you all will remember, the World Health Organization, in an effort to reduce tobacco-related deaths, decided that they would try to discourage sales of tobacco by forcing tobacco manufacturers to use plain paper packaging. And a lot of tobacco companies actually have tried to argue against this from the point of view of intellectual property rights. And they're saying, no, this is bad for branding. And we actually took, MIPA actually took a survey among our members, and we asked them, do you think that we should take this issue as something that is an assault against intellectual property rights? And by a majority, both those who were active and passive, that means they were against the use of IP to counter health issues, because at the end of the day, life is more important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. I think you have elaborated your point very well. And you have also raised a very pertinent question and comments on the report itself. And I think I can ask Philip Stevens to later on maybe comment on some of these questions. I already said I'm going to moderate, so I'm in an easy position. I don't have to defend the report. But maybe Phil will come back to some of these points. You've also anticipated actually some of the questions which are coming up on Slido already. So that's good moving forward. I was just reminded when you were talking about Microsoft and licensed and unlicensed software, just last week, I was trying to install looking for this licensed version for my son's laptop. And obviously it was expensive, and I thought, oh, you don't need that expensive software. Let me search for the alternatives. And I found a free open source compatible software, which is working very fine. So there are alternatives which market has generated, and this open source technology has come up for the rescue of consumers, right? So great, thank you. We now move to Dr. Ida. She has some slides which she'll continue to talk from here, but also some slides will be shared. Okay, please.
Thank you very much. It doesn't matter, I can speak from here. I just want to continue the discussion with regards to the relationship between intellectual property and economic development or growth. I share the sentiment of the moderator that says, the evidence that IP is directly linked to economic progress or development is something that is worth further examination. Because in my research, and I've been in the IP area for like 30 years, and I've met many economists as well as IP professors from around the world. There are quite a lot of academics or professors who are actually quite skeptical of whether IP actually leads to economic development or growth, because IP is not the sole factor that enterprises relied on to sell their goods and to enter other markets. So IP alone should not be considered as the factor for economic development and growth. And I can quote many economists who said that. I was hoping Jomo would be here because he was hypercritical of this whole theory or notion. But it's not the only one that I have met within my 30 years in intellectual property field. And I remember 30 years or 20 years or maybe 10 years ago, we did a study with the Japan Patent Office. There were academics from China, from India, from Malaysia, and a few more ASEAN countries where we compare the IP protection, and then we try to sort of link it to economic development. And you'll be surprised to see that, even though India and China was still lagging behind in terms of intellectual property protection back then, 10 years ago, but they were catching up very fast in terms of technological development, which actually points to perhaps the readiness of our industry and our manufacturing sector, to actually come out with competitive products that will be able to be, market globally. For a long, long time, I think our companies are essentially manufacturing or contract manufacturer for other countries, and because of that, we are not, leading in terms of technology. We are just using other people's technology. And if you look at the data with regard to trade in intellectual property, because the presenter just now was showing how US economy depends on IP and how trade in IP has gone up over the years. But they are the only country that is actually benefiting from IP trade. Malaysia, in terms of IP trade, the statistics in Malaysia is in a deficit. There's a big gap between the export of, the income we receive from export of IP and the amount that we pay for the usage of intellectual property. So in a way, Malaysia is more of a technology user, and if you use US as a benchmark for the protection of intellectual property, then I think we are not in the right path, because US is on a different trajectory path altogether. Now, IP is not the only legal rights existing in this world. IP must be looked in other realm as well. For example, if you look at even WIPO in its TRIPS agreement, pays respect or recognition to members' privilege to formulate or amend their laws and regulations and to adopt measures necessary to protect public health and nutrition and to promote the public interest in sectors of vital importance to their socio-economic and technological development. So there are other factors that you have to take into account when you frame your intellectual property protection. I agree that IPR is very important, but the question is, how strong is the IPR? We must have the right IPR system with the right balance that not only assures the interests of the IP owners, but also the interests of the public at large. Now, I do want to comment on certain parts of the report. Okay. There was a recommendation with regards to that there is a need to not discriminate against specific technologies in the granting of patents. Now, this is already in practice in Malaysia. When it comes to the examination of patent application, we give similar treatment to all types of technology. Now, I believe the reason why you put this recommendation is with regards to pharmaceutical goods, right? With regards to pharmaceutical goods. Now, when it comes to examining the patentability, we treat them almost on the same manner, but there is a concern with regards to second medical use, third medical use, and further medical use, whether that challenges the notion of novelty. Okay, so if I mean, you quote the position in India and Argentina, how they come out with guidelines on novelty and inventive steps with regards to pharmaceutical goods. But those are on the line of novelty, rather than we are trying to discriminate against pharmaceutical technology. Now, regards to your recommendation to restrict the use of compulsory licensing of patents through emergencies, again, I agree with Ben that, compulsory licensing, after all, is a legitimate tool that is even allowed under the TRIPS agreement. It's a legitimate tool. Now, Malaysia is not the only country that issues compulsory license. Again, in Malaysia, that was not compulsory license, but that was actually government use, to be used only in government public hospitals. And I mean, there were only 2 occasions that we issue government use. And these are instances of very drastic contrast between the price of the drugs and the cost of the production of the drugs. Like, for example, with regards to hepatitis C, the cost of the treatment is so exorbitant that it is costing a burden to government hospitals, right? And that's the reason why compulsory government use license had to be given out in respect to hepatitis C. There was only 2 instances. The first instance is HIV. Now, these 2 instances are, for me, real, true public interest or health reasons for us to issue compulsory license. What you have forgotten is that other countries issue compulsory license on even weaker grounds. I think Malaysia has been using it very restrictively, all right, restrictively, and only on good reasons. Okay. Now, there was also a recommendation, 2 minutes, okay, with regards to enable courts and officials to act against goods that infringe trademarks, including those in transit between countries. You have to remember that TRIPS agreement do not put obligation to apply such procedures to imports, all right? And I would, with regard to regulatory data protection for medicines, I remember a discourse between IP professors whether regulatory data protection is actually part of intellectual property, because if you look at TRIPS agreement, it basically says, to protect such data against unfair commercial use, unfair commercial use, which is, different than when we are talking about regulatory data protection nowadays. Now, the last point is in the context of copyright. Now, I've been involved in copyright reform for many, many years, since 1995, and I believe that our copyright law is beyond many, many countries in terms of its TRIPS plus. Because not only we have amended the law to accede to WCT and WPPT, but in some areas our rights and obligations are even higher than that. So I wish, the statement in this report is to be clarified a bit. I know it's not a technical report, but perhaps, some further information should be added, to give a clearer view of what Malaysian intellectual property system is, the level of our protection, and so on. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe Dr. Tay, you can right away start your presentation or your points. Yeah,
thank you. Mr. Ali Salman, and good afternoon to all of you. Let me start off by addressing 2 points that you talked about at the beginning. The first being whether there is a correlation between strong IP and good economic progress, and also secondly, whether the granting of IP rights amount to a monopoly. With regard to my first point, whether there is a correlation between strong IP rights and good economic progress, let me take on further from what Professor Ida said. I agree that there is a correlation between IP rights protection and economic progress. And there are many research that actually suggests that. But then the question is, does strong IP protection correlate with good economic progress? And I think that is questionable. It might be well to say, well, US has very strong IP rights, and look at their economy. Or maybe Singapore as well. You know, they are top in ASEAN in terms of economy. But let's look at Singapore. They have very strong IP rights. But part of the reason for the strong IP rights is because of their obligations under free trade agreements. They have free trade agreements with the European Union, with the US, and so there is a trade-off. They benefit some and they, give in some. But we are in the process of looking at, FTAs with EU and US, and, the government has to evaluate very carefully whether is it worth it all. So imposing very strong IP rights may not actually lead to very good economic progress. Though, yes, IP rights, there is a correlation with economic progress. Now, the second point is with regard to whether IP rights is a monopoly. In a way, yes. But we really have to look at the stakeholders involved, at least two stakeholders that we are concerned with. The first is the IP owner who has invested lots of money and time in creating the work, and the other one is the public who want to use the work. So the IP owner obviously wants some form of exclusive rights, and that's where the IP rights come in. But to what extent should we give them IP rights? Because whatever extra rights we give to IP owners, it actually translates to us taking from public domain what the public could have done before and taking it out and giving it to IP rights, therefore depriving the public. Well, let's take the library situation. The books in the library, we can take them out, we can read them, we cannot photocopy portions of it. But let's look at digital works on the internet. At times, especially those databases that we have to buy in order to access that document, we cannot even access the document, let alone print it out, unless we pay for it. So what we could do in the physical world, where we can go to the library, take a book, look at it, and decide whether we want to photocopy or not. But when it comes to digital work, we can't even access it in the first place. And so what I'm trying to say is IP rights, whatever you give to the IP owner, it just means that you are taking away from the public what they could have done previously. And I understand that, I think so we really have to see it as a balance, balancing the interests of the IP owner as well as the public. So that is what I want to comment with regard to the points that you raised earlier. And I share the concerns about the compulsory licensing, that we do have provisions under compulsory licensing and rights of government use for medicines, and they are very carefully used. So, at the moment, there should not be any concern about these two provisions. And even, let's say, in international obligations, they allow us to have these provisions. Now, let me move on to the second point with regard to what I think the IP system in Malaysia could be improved in order to promote a stronger relation with ASEAN. As was pointed out in the report, we stand in a fairly good position with regard to our IP rights. I think what could be improved is with regard to the digital technology part. If you think about our IP laws, our Copyright Act 1987, Patents Act 1983, Trademarks Act 1976, these were all enacted during a time when digital technology wasn't at the center stage. Of course, these were amended along the way to try to cope with new technology. But, technology moves in so much faster than what Parliament can cope. And so there are gaps in our legislation, which I think, should be looked into. So, for example, when you talk about artificial intelligence, works are created by artificial intelligence. There is no human involved. But yet, if you look at our copyright law, it presupposes that the author is a human. So, if a work is created by artificial intelligence, who is the author? And authorship is very important for copyright law because the first author is usually the copyright owner. And also the duration of copyright depends on the author as well. Then again, if there is infringement, does the artificial intelligence sue? Who sues who? Does the robot sue the infringer? And or do you sue the robot? There are gaps in these. Then also the other thing is with regard to online enforcement, online infringement of works. Under the copyright law in our 2012 amendment, the government has taken a very good step providing for the notice and take-down procedure, where, if you think that somebody online has actually infringed your rights, you could give a notice to the internet service provider, ask him to take it down, and if the so-called infringer is not happy, then he responds, and, if finally they are not happy, then they bring the matter to court. So there is a notice and take-down procedure. But if we look at the trademark system, and our trademark bill 2019 is going to come into force very soon. And yet, if we look at our trademark bill, there is no equivalent. But remember, you and I often buy things online. There is Lazada, there is Presto Mall, there is Shopee, attracting us. And, we know that some of these websites sell counterfeit products. And so what recourse? We don't have a similar recourse of notice and take down as is available in copyright. And so I think that, with our Trademarks Bill 2019, this is something that, we should think about. Right. The other thing also is with regard to what Benjamin Thompson said, that we have specialized IP courts doing a very, very good job indeed. But at the same time, we should not forget that there is another avenue of IP dispute, which is also good, which is arbitration. And the good thing about arbitrators is that you can appoint arbitrators who have specialized knowledge in that dispute. Judges are good, but they are, remember, legally trained. In arbitration, especially where disputes concern very technical matters, I think we should avail ourselves more to arbitration. Right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thay. Thank you all the panelists for sharing their diverse views on this important topic. We started this symposium about 15 minutes delay, so we will just catch up in the next 15 minutes and conclude the panel. There are several questions which I have received on Slido, so thank you for contributing with these questions. Many of them actually pertain to the issue of medicine and healthcare and IP, so I'm not going to go there directly. But I'm going to start with a general question, which actually is related with innovation, so maybe Mr. Nasser would like to answer. And later, I would request Philip Stevens to maybe respond to some of those, the points which panelists have raised in general. So I'll come back to you, Philip, in a minute. But a question for Mr. Nasser maybe is that, the views from this panel have been that mostly critical of IP. But if Malaysia aspires to be part of, Industrial Revolution 4.0, then which definitely puts a premium on knowledge, innovation, and IP, and become a developer of IP, not just user of IP. How can we balance that aspiration of IR 4.0 innovation and this view on the IP? Yeah.
Thank you, Ali, for the question. And I realize that my three esteemed panelists are legal background, and their comments have pretty much been skewed towards legal. I'm not a legal person by training, and as I started out in my comment, the focus of AIM is the production of IP. IP creates wealth, in our opinion, if it's managed appropriately. And when we create wealth, we create IP, that is going to lead us to high-income nation, and that's the goal for AIM. By the year 2020, we are a high-income nation. Now, how are we going about doing it? I think what I can say here is that, comment from both Dr. Ida and Dr. Tay, there is a positive correlation between IPs and economic growth. So at least we are all on the same page there. Now, how are we going to do that? Looking at the presentation just now, Malaysia's Global Innovation Index ranking has been hovering between 33, 35, but it's at that level we need to really move up. And therefore, one of the elements of measurement is IP export, IP import. Again, Dr. Ida mentioned we are a user, we are a consumer rather than a producer of IP. So we need to address this so that we can bump up the ranking. So what is happening now here is the new government has taken some proactive steps. You may have heard Tun Wai, Prime Minister, in the midterm RMK 11 review, announced that the government has decided to launch the Research Management Agency, which is the one-stop agency that's going to be responsible for advising the government what R&D areas should the country be focusing on. We now have 9 focus areas in our R&D. We've got water security, food safety, cyber security, urbanization and transport, and 9 items. Do we need to maintain these 9 items? Should we focus on areas where it's going to give us the maximum bang for our buck? If you look at the statistics from the Global Commercial Index, Sweden spends less money than Malaysia, but their return on investment is much higher than us. It goes back again, production of IP is good, but we want quality IPs. So who's going to advise the government what are the areas we're going to focus on so that we produce quality IPs? So the task is now given to Ministry of Economic Affairs to start working on the ground to launch the Research Management Agency. The other area where Malaysia is going to move up the value chain and become high-income nation is, and this is, credit should go to our IP office, MIPO. On 6th of September, they called for the very first time meetings amongst all the government agencies, ministries, towards developing a one-stop shop agency, whatever you call, to manage the commercialization of the IPs in Malaysia, for all the funding given by the government to universities, public research institute. So that is something that, whilst MIPO is the regulator, the patent office, they're taking this one step. I'm producing all these IPs. I mean, I have the registry of all these IPs. Can I get another agency that has got strength in commercialization to create value from these IPs to the market, so that, again, to the point Dr. Ida mentioned, we become the exporter of IP, technology rather than consumer of IP. So that conversation has taken place on 6th of September, and the second meeting has been called, I think it's next week. So these steps are being taken to address the production of intellectual capital, the production of IP, so that we can move up the value chain to become high-income nation.
Thank you for a very comprehensive answer, and also thank you for presenting some work by MIPO. I mean, we were missing, we had the Director General confirmed, but he had to travel. I'm grateful that you did mention, and so we felt that part covered, so thank you for that. May I request Phil Stevens to actually respond to some of the comments directly on the report? Yeah, please, Phil. We have a microphone.
Thank you. I'm delighted that some people have actually read it. That's praise indeed. Thank you very much. I won't respond to all the individual comments because there were quite a lot. It was a bit depressing to go through them all one by one. But I just want to make a broad overall comment. I think some of the criticisms are based on a kind of static understanding of the role of IP. The world has changed very dramatically over the last 20 years, 30 years. Globalization has increased and countries are more interconnected. Malaysia is no longer a developing country, and it can't have a developing country attitude to IP where it sees it as something to consume, and there's no interest in protecting the rights of IP holders beyond accepting a very minimal way consonant with its international obligations. I think that's quite a counsel of despair, and I think for the future of Malaysia, which is growing very rapidly and the world around it is changing very rapidly, it makes sense to upgrade and change its IP with the changing economy around it. Going to a minimum standard and to find loopholes and exceptions in every case might do you benefits in the very short term, but in the longer term it won't necessarily underpin your transition to the high income status. So I think there's a debate to be had about the various specific recommendations in the panel. But for Malaysia's future and its transition to high income, which I hope will come very soon, I think hopefully we'll see a more positive attitude to IP and an adapting and changing IP system that changes with technology and changes with the way global trade is changing as well. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now I have some of the questions, as I mentioned, about medicines usage, but I feel that many of these points have been addressed already by the panelists. Any points from here, please? Okay, Amir, we have shortage of mics, so you have to do some exercise here.
Good afternoon. I am Jafar Ahmad, the president of Myanmar Ethnic Rohingya Human Rights Organization Malaysia, Mehro. I would like to thank every speaker and panelists and the moderator. Thank you so much. And organizing community, chairperson, invite me. I know this report is that I want to say the writing the bonds as a political security pact. That we are one to the indigenous people in the ASEAN community, ASEAN ethnic. But this is, I do not engage this event, the issue that today, very important, this issue that our ASEAN ethnic for survival is the equally right. Before we do more about the ASEAN regions, ASEAN community, we can survive in the equally right and justice and peace. But this is a very important meeting that we are also ASEAN ethnic, ASEAN community. We are survival in the genocide in ASEAN.
Thank you.
But I need to help us, please, your resolution, some put for Rohingya issue. Before we want to do something, we must property for human life and human equality must be first property for human life and human freedom and justice.
Yeah, thank you for your
we are also continue. Thank you for your organizing committee, also panelists. I hope you do something for our survival and our right and justice to ASEAN country, ASEAN ethnic. We are want to ASEAN ethnic.
Yeah,
we need to protection for your support, every of all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, I think this was a discussion or maybe a very relevant point for the earlier panel we had on the ASEAN. This is more on the intellectual property, but I do respect the sentiments which you have shared, certainly very respectful. But coming back on ASEAN, actually, one of the questions asked, I don't know if one of the panelists want to respond to it, but I want to alert Lawrence. Maybe you have to answer, because this question comes back to the CPTPP, ASEAN, and the IP. If any panelists want to comment, the question is the reason for Malaysia to, in terms of reluctance to ratify CPTPP, is IP a major hurdle or not? That is the question. So anyone want to comment on that? Or, okay.
Can I say
Please.
something about that? CTPP is the successor for the TPPA. TPPA had IP provisions in it, but when CTPP took over, the members agreed to suspend a large part of the IP provisions. So that's the position right now. The IP provisions have not yet been finalized, so I don't imagine that IP could be a key reason why the government is hesitant in signing the CTPP.
Thank you for your thoughts. Lauren, do you want to add anything here? Because you authored a report on CPTPP before.
Sure. I mean, I would just say that, I think what the Prof is saying is right, that since the US withdrawal, those IP provisions have been sort of scaled down and suspended. But I think, in a way, the bigger question is these IP questions will probably be raised in future trade deals too. So the question is, I think, in this discussion, how do we develop, in response to some of the points Philip was making and the concerns the panel has raised, how does Malaysia kind of want to approach IP and international trade going forward, even if that issue isn't kind of pressed specifically in CPTPP. And then on the CPTPP itself, I think, following the withdrawal of the US, that issue has been minimized in the context of that specific treaty.
Right. Thank you. Okay, Azrul, please. This may be the last intervention of the day. I don't see any other newer questions on Slido or any. Please, Azrul. Yeah.
Hi. Just wanting a comment. I share Philip's concerns with regards to the panel's direction of discussion, and certainly a comment that was raised in one of the presentations that we should not benchmark ourselves basically against the best practice IPR, and that we need to find a more suitable level for Malaysia, and putting ourselves in a sort of less than able category of countries. And a quote that says, there are things that we need to pick and choose from the IP system to benefit our local companies to ensure that they can compete. I mean, this sentiment, I would argue, flies against the spirit of competition. I would like to think that our Malaysian companies are just as capable as producing world-class products that are able to compete at international stage without having to infringe or make exclusions with regards to IP. But the panel right now seems to imply that Malaysia needs to carve out exceptions for itself when it comes to this issue, because we are less able to compete, which is, I think, against the spirit of this new government, which is trying to bring Malaysia up to IR 4.0. And the problem here is this. If we say that, and we expect reciprocity from other countries because Malaysian products that we expect to be covered under IP protections in those countries, they could say very well the same things for our products too. Because it works both ways. We have to be able to respect. This is how IP protections. So I would take exception to some of the comments that were raised earlier and say that Malaysia has shown its ability to be able to compete without having to depend on these provisions. And sorry, that is one, but I just wanted to raise one additional issue concerning compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing is used for emergencies or exceptional conditions which are determined by the government. So it can be anything. Yeah, that's what it says under TRIPS. However, the problem is this. How would you respond to a possible development that says that the government intends to export the very same government use license or the compulsory license products to other countries, which is against the spirit of TRIPS? Thank you.
Thank you, Azrul, for this intervention. I would like to say that, of course, the panel have different views, and I would not say that the whole panel had same view. There was diversity of the views within the panelists, and that we respect these views being part of the open discussion and dialogue. Any last thoughts before I move to the conclusion? Maybe quick 1 minute interventions from each of the panelists. Okay, the mic is here. Does it work?
Thanks, Ali. Thanks, Azrul. I think two things. One is we're not critical of IP. I think when I speak for myself, we were criticizing or giving some critique on some of the conclusions and recommendations in the agreement. And number two, we didn't talk about exceptions. We talked about prioritizing, because we're talking about scarce resources that the government has. And if they're going to be strengthening the IPR system, and one example was the delay in patent examination and prosecution. And so we were saying that it must be prioritized to the immediate needs of the nation, as opposed to trying to throw 100 patent examiners at a problem when we can't afford to do so. So it is not about exceptions. It is, we are still playing by the rules, but when we are playing catch-up, we need to focus first on the things which will immediately benefit the nation, as opposed to, for example, benefit any other country, superpower, for example, which has interest in our trade. That was the point.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Nasr, any final thought?
Yeah, I was just reminded just before we started, YB Ong Kian Ming asked AIM, asked me, has there been any recent awards given to industry partnering with academia to solve business problems? Because we invited him to launch, to give the award last October to 3 companies. And the whole idea is like I said, we want knowledge to be generated from Malaysia, if at all possible. If we don't have that, we need to find technology out there that can bring to Malaysia for Malaysia to prosper. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So the point here is that even in AIM, when the industry has got issues to come up with a better product to compete in ASEAN, and it was mentioned just now that MNCs do not share knowledge with us. They come and sparingly share. We want our business community to tap on the knowledge and skills of our local universities and subject matter experts. Hence, at AIM, we brought in the German platform, Steinbeis, wherein the subject matter experts who are not available in Malaysia will have access to 49 other countries for the benefit of Malaysia. So again, we do not want to reinvent the wheel. If we can bring technology in, share the creation of IP, help to make it a Malaysian product, and develop a product for Malaysia to sell, I think that's what we want.
Thank you. Dr. Tay?
Right. 2 points in relation to the 2 questions raised. One is, why not have stronger IP rights since we have companies that are doing very well internationally? Well, yes, we can have very strong IP rights, but that also ties down our own people. Our manufacturers who want to build up a name for themselves are also bound by that strong IP. Can we cope? Once we adopt a very strong IP right, it's very hard to justify taking on a reverse gear, to go on a reverse gear. That's one thing. So we need concrete evidence that that there is sufficient mass of people in the industry who can actually cope with this stronger IP rights. And the other thing is with regard to the compulsory licensing and export to other countries. I think this was already debated in the Doha debate that some countries, like the least developed countries, don't have the manufacturing capacity to manufacture drugs. So we can well give them compulsory licensing, but they just simply can't do it. So countries like Malaysia, when we have compulsory licensing and we use that, we should be at liberty to sell to these countries that equally need it. That was the justification for the export.
Thank you. Thank you. Final thoughts from Dr. Ida?
Right. I just want to dispel the notion that the IPR system in Malaysia is not strong. We have a world-class IPR system. We have acceded to many international treaties. All right. The dispute is not whether Malaysian intellectual property system is not strong or not. But once you benchmark it with US economy, other countries which have a different kind of economic development, then that's not a very fair assessment. But as far as the IP system is concerned, over the years, the last 3 decades, because most of us are in this panel, we are all IP practitioners, we are involved in IP reform, and over the last 3 decades, we have revised and revised and revised and revised and strengthened and strengthened and strengthened up to no point, all right? What we are questioning is the methodology where you compare Malaysia with, different, with a country with a different economy or economic system. Now, with regards to exports, I think that has already been dealt with by Prof. Dr. David San. Now, in relation to public health is a very important issue, and I believe the new government or Pakatan Harapan government is very concerned about access to medicine and prioritizing public health. So we have to thread this issue very carefully. There are exceptions which are allowed under international treaties, and these exceptions are even practiced around the world. Even the US, they issue compulsory license. Don't think that US do not issue compulsory license at all. Sometimes their courts issue compulsory license for technologies that have become standard. We have cases like Microsoft. That was the first case in US, and there was a Microsoft case in Europe as well. So please don't think that compulsory license is that evil and is not being practiced in other economies. It is being practiced. It's whether you are practicing it on good grounds and you follow the procedures or not. And as far as compulsory license is concerned, like I mentioned, in Malaysia, it's only for government use. And these are for, HIV and for hepatitis C. And I have, patients, I have people actually came to my office and say, oh, we are, representing the HIV plus group. Yes, Prof, can you do something for us? Because the treatment is so exorbitant. You're talking about 3,000 times more. You're not talking about 100 times more. It's about 3,000 times more. This is where the price is so exorbitant, and that's where you need to step in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ida. And thank you all the panelists for sharing your views very candidly. Let's thank them all. And before we close in, I will switch hats again as CEO of Ideas, back from moderator to CEO of Ideas. But I will not say for next 10 minutes. I will take only 1 minute. And that is to say, I think partly reflecting what last interjection from the floor was made, where does Malaysia stand in terms of economic development, and how does innovation fits in? I think there is, we need to look at the country more optimistically, and to cite an evidence from the World Competitiveness Report. Out of 140 countries, Malaysia stands in innovation at number 19 out of 140 countries. And in terms of innovation capability, it stands at number 30, which is consistent with its ranking with the World Bank Ease of Doing Business. So Malaysia has done very well in terms of economic progress. And as I think everyone is saying here, that the over years IPR regime in Malaysia has been improving, has been strengthening. There are issues around public health which needs to be addressed. That is well acknowledged. But overall, the direction of the country has been towards more protection and better protection for IPR. And I think there is broadly a consensus. There is no question, there is no disagreement in the panel that as far as economic progress is concerned, IPs are helpful. Right? So there's absolutely no disagreement on that. So with that message, I think we can conclude this panel. Thank you again, and over to Mariam to finally conclude this. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Ali, and thank you also, esteemed panelists. All right, I think that concludes the end of our event for today. I hope you've enjoyed the forum, as I did. There is much to deliberate and do in playing our part to ensure Malaysia's progress in making the ASEAN happen. So hopefully, like, you know, as mentioned previously, 10, 50 years from now, we'll call ourselves ASEAN members instead. All right. Again, another set of special thanks to all of you, and perhaps a quick photo session. All right.
50 years, you should be looking at Yeah? You have to read it? Okay.
Thank you again to panel members, audiences, for taking your time out today to join and stay towards the end, until the end of this forum. Before I close off, kindly note that we do have prepared some light dinner just to the side again, to some place. So do help yourself, get refreshed before you go home, and hope that this forum has provided with enough content to spark more discussion from the audience. Yes. That's all from me. Have a good evening and a safe trip home. Just another quick announcement. You can validate your parking ticket at the business center site.